Welcome back. My name is Dr. Chris Erskine, and we are going to study today the resurgence of the conservative movement in the United States. Welcome to Top Up's U.S. History class. So the first thing I want to do, and you can look at the first slide, but the first thing I want to do is help you understand what the word conservative means in American politics. And so the word conserve in English means to save. The word progress means to move forward or to change. And so today when we think about someone who is a conservative in politics, it's someone who wants things to stay the same. They don't want things to change. Someone who's a progressive or a liberal wants things to move forward. Now, Republicans are conservatives and Democrats are liberals. And Republicans also want things to move forward, but they want to save the important things. Democrats want to save the important things, and they want to move forward. They both would describe themselves in the same way, using the words that I have used. But they have very different ways of thinking about things. So, for example, Republicans believe that a woman should not be able to choose to get an abortion. Democrats believe that a woman should be able to choose to get an abortion. Republicans believe in lower taxes. If you work hard for it, then you should keep it. Democrats believe in taxes that are a little bit higher. You work hard for it, you should keep it, they believe. But some people are very poor and they need some help, like medical care, that everyone should have medical care. And Democrats believe that, and Republicans don't support that position. So those are some differences in the two. And in the late 1970s, after Gerald Ford, who's Republican, comes Jimmy Carter, who's a Democrat. And Jimmy Carter doesn't have a very good presidency. But what we do see after Jimmy Carter, we're not really talking about Jimmy Carter today very much, but what we see around the time that Jimmy Carter leaves office, he runs for president again. He was president from 1976 to 1980. He runs again in 1980, but he loses to Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan is a Republican. Jimmy Carter's a Democrat. Now we're looking at this slide, conservative resurgence. Democrats, the Democratic motto, the Democratic animal, symbol, logo is a donkey, and Republicans are an elephant. And those two symbols today, everyone in America understands. And so here in this case, we see the elephant stomping on top of the donkey. That means that the Democrats lose and Republicans win. Now, on the next slide, here's the question. What caused this conservative resurgence? Because people don't just trample on another group of people, or they're not able to successfully push their ideas forward unless it's in response to something specifically. And in this case, we have to think about the 1960s with the hippie movement, all of the crazy rock and roll music, all of the drugs, and this goes into the 60s and the 70s. The fear of the Black Panthers, that means black people that now have civil rights and can have guns. And so people are afraid of that. The fear of hippies, anti-government approach. The Republicans believe there's a loss of moral values. One of those is Roe v. Wade. Now, this is a Supreme Court decision which gives women the right to have the choice to have an abortion. And the Vietnam War is confusing to Americans, and we lost. It's so embarrassing. So we have to do something to get American confidence back. And of course, the Watergate scandal during Nixon's presidency. So look at the next slide. We see conservative renaissance. So some of the things that conservatives oppose is abortion, rights for homosexuals like gay marriage. They oppose the counterculture or hippie movement because they believe it ruined American values and morals. Things that they're in favor of. They want prayer in schools. They believe that the 60s generation corrupted America. They want easy access to guns for Americans. And people on the right, the conservative movement, they're religious. They're evangelicals, meaning they go out and try to make other people Christian, try to convince them to become Christian. And so the Republicans team up in the late 1970s with Christians and with the gun lobby, the gun people who want to have guns. And they kind of come around this new Republican Party. And out of this new Republican Party from 1980 with Ronald Reagan, who brings new ideas as well, you have this new Republican Party, and it just dominates for much of all of the 1980s and into the 1990s. The next slide, we can see Reagan, his domestic policy. Remember, we talked about domestic meaning policies at home, and international as policies overseas. And so Reagan cuts housing subsidy to the poor because if people, remember, Republicans are against higher taxes. If you work for your money, you keep it. And so Reagan's idea was if you give the rich people more money, they will create bigger businesses, and that business will hire more people to work, and that it's good for everyone. Democrats don't believe that it works that way, and Republicans do. Most economists today don't believe that trickle-down economics works very well. But Reagan believes that he does cut the housing subsidy. He doesn't give money to poor people for housing. He doesn't give as much help, as much money to states to help with their welfare programs. The number of people who are homeless in the United States goes way up. Home ownership, the number of people in the United States that own a home, goes way down. Government spending goes up. The amount of money that you make goes down. The amount of crime and criminals goes up. But Reagan does a lot of good things too. And so these things domestically are not good, but many Americans pointed to the fact that he lowered taxes. Now, if we look at the next slide, we can see Americans thought of Democrats as tax collectors. All they want to do is collect taxes, and Democrats would argue with that and say that that's not true. But Republicans, that was a very easy way to call a Democrat and say he's just a tax collector. The highest tax bracket was 70%. It had been that way since World War II. That doesn't mean you paid 70% of all of your income, but it's what's called a graduated or progressive income. So maybe you only pay 10% on the first 10,000, and then you pay 20% on the next 100,000. By the time you get to the very top, you pay 70%. This is something you talk more about in economics class and principles of business and personal finance. So we won't spend too much time talking about that here. But Reagan is president for 8 years. And by the time he leaves office, the tax rate is 28%. And so most of the people that got a tax cut are the rich people. The people in the middle, in the lower class, they don't get a tax cut really, because people that were paying 70% tax, they were making millions of dollars a year. Middle class, I was probably only paying 30% tax anyway. And so now with Reagan, I pay a little bit less, but not very much. And so with lower taxes, that means that the amount of money the government collects, the government income, goes down. But under Reagan, because we're trying to defeat the Soviet Union in the Cold War with the arms race, government spending goes up. And so this is problematic. And in the next slide, what you see is a decade by decade graph of American debt. And so we start on the left side, and we can see that the debt stays pretty level. Then we get to just about mid-1970s, it starts to go up a little bit. And then when we get to Reagan, it goes up. Get to Bush, it goes up. It levels off a little bit with Clinton. And then with the second Bush, it goes way up. And if we were to have Obama on that map, it would continue to go straight up. And it's not because all of these later presidents are spending too much money. It's because the government doesn't have as much money to collect because of the income that it cut off from itself with the Reagan era tax cuts. Now, it's not that simple. There's a lot more to it than that. But that's one easy way to start to look at and begin to understand the tax cuts and how much money we're spending and the current debt that we have today. The debt that we have today under Donald Trump is probably somewhere around $19 or $20 trillion. So it continues to go up. On the next slide, we see that evangelical Protestants, meaning Christians, they find a voice in the Republican Party. They feel like people are listening to them, and so the Republican politicians, the officials, and so they want to support them. These social issues, meaning abortion, homosexuality, school prayer, creation versus evolution, or science versus the Bible. These are major issues for Republicans. And so you see here in this picture on this slide, we can see an elephant. That's the Republican symbol with an American flag on their back, and that elephant is carrying a cross. And so Republicans, Americans, and Christians is all in one, is what that picture is saying. The Republicans are carrying the cross of Christianity on their back. On the next slide, we see neoconservatives. Now, neoconservatives are, as is in the 1960s, as the Republican Party begins to change and the Democratic Party begins to change, we get people who call themselves neoconservatives. Many of them are Democrats that leave the Democratic Party and join the Republican Party. And that's really in the 1960s and 70s. But here's the thing. In this neocons, as we call them, in the 70s and 80s and even 90s and even today, they believe in American exceptionalism. Now, what is that? That's a term that Americans have heard, but some Americans really don't know what it means. A lot of Americans, and Republicans especially, believe that America is better than any other country in the world. America should lead. America should be the boss of the world. Democrats or liberals, progressives, don't believe that as much. They believe that America is equal to other countries, that they like American values, but America should not be pushing other people around. And so we can see, for example, with President Obama, who was a Democrat. He worked very much with a team of other foreign leaders. And we can see with Donald Trump, who was a Republican. He believes very much more in America pushing its way and trying to do whatever it needs to do to make sure that you do what we want you to do. And so that's the Republican approach versus the Democrat approach. American exceptionalism. Are we a shining city on a hill? Should we be the world's policeman? Are we the best policeman? Well, if you ask a Democrat and a Republican, you're going to get two different answers. But during the 1960s and 70s, we begin to see many Democrats defect to the Republican Party. And Ronald Reagan is one of them. Ronald Reagan was a Democrat, and then he switched over to the Republican Party. On this next slide, we can see Reagan's Revolution. That's what this is called when Reagan comes into office, because he does a lot of things, particularly with lowering taxes. He believes that American values have deteriorated. Remember, the moral values from the 1960s and 70s, conservatives think are bad. And so Republicans come in and they want to fix those. And many Democrats think that the hippie movement was also, kind of deteriorated some American values. But he believes in a New Deal for all Americans, meaning that Americans should have lower taxes, we should have better family values, we should have better opportunities. And he also believes in a smaller government, a smaller federal government. He believes in a strong military, believes in lower taxes, and this is called the Reagan Revolution. And look what happens. This is what he campaigns on some of these ideas. And in 1980, look at the next slide, you can see he wins, and he even wins Massachusetts. He wins California, which is his home state, but California usually goes Democrat these days. And so Georgia and Minnesota, he doesn't win, and that's because Jimmy Carter, the current president in 1980, was from Georgia, and his vice president, Walter Mondale, was from Minnesota. So that explains those two states. So that's a landslide victory for Ronald Reagan, and now he believes that he has this mandate, or he has permission, he has direction from the American people to go ahead and enact, carry out his ideas and his beliefs and values. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those things, the end of the Cold War, in the next lesson. See you guys then. Bye-bye.